Well, good evening, everyone. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Father Richard Finn, the director of the Las Casas Institute for Social Justice, and it's my great pleasure to welcome all of you here this evening. I'd like to extend an especial welcome to the members of the Oxford Consortium for Human Rights, as Blackfriars with the Institute is your Oxford home, and we are very proud of you and very pleased to welcome you here. I hope that your workshops and discussions are going well this week, and I very much look forward to hearing about them and to meeting with you over supper later. But I also welcome our other guests here this evening, both those joining us in the room and those who are attending online. For those of you new to Blackfriars, we're a community of some 20 Dominican friars. We're also a hall of Oxford University with some 60 postgraduate students with a concentration in philosophy, theology, and social sciences. We're home to two research institutes, the Las Casas Institute and the Aquinas Institute, which promotes study and the importance of Thomism in contemporary thought. And finally, we're what's called a Dominican Studium, a centre for training religious for the Catholic priesthood. Well, tonight, this is a premiere, the first annual lecture in human rights, sponsored by the Oxford Consortium, and as the first, fittingly dedicated to the life and work of Bartolome de Las Casas, the 16th century friar who championed the rights of indigenous peoples and the inspiration for our research institute. Who better then to give this lecture than Dr. Fernando Cervantes, reader in history at Bristol University, author in 2020 of Conquistadores, A New History, someone who is an expert on the intellectual and religious history of early modern Spain and Spanish America, and who is himself a lay Dominican and a member of the Institute's advisory board. We are honoured and delighted, Fernando, that you've agreed to inaugurate this lecture series. And I invite you now to talk to us on Las Casas and his world, the defender of the Indians in context. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Richard. It's needless to say, a great pleasure to be here, to be able to talk to you about this chap. If I can bring I decided not to print the lecture, so I need to fiddle around with gadgets and find it. I thought it was there. It is there. So I'm delighted to be able to speak to you about the man after whom the institute that is hosting this event is named. This is not without interest and certainly not as straightforward as it may sound. I'll begin with a little story which happened a few years ago, roughly at the time when the financial crisis began in 2007 and 2008. The institute was just beginning its life. And I remember Timothy Ratcliffe, who, as you know, was one of the main driving forces behind the Institute's foundation, one day reported to the board of the Institute with a clear mixture of amusement and exasperation that some members of the university had advised him to change the name of the Institute. He reported that he had asked them why, and he said, well, you know, nobody's heard of this fellow Las Casas, you know. You're not doing yourself any favors, old chap. You better find someone better known. Well, if any of you know Timothy, you will not be surprised to hear that he stood his ground firmly. He expressed surprise that nobody had heard of Las Casas, and then he underlined that if it really was the case that nobody had heard him, heard of him, they jolly well ought to have heard of him. And therefore the Las Casas Institute for Social Justice remained and remains to this day the Las Casas Institute for Social Justice. So thank you for that, Timothy. Well, this anecdote, I decided to start with this anecdote because it really encapsulates a very curious paradox which will be at the center of what I want to say today. And it is this. On the one hand, it is unfortunately the case that Las Casas is not very well known, if he is known at all, outside specialist studies of early Latin America. On the other hand, if you do venture to read about early Latin America, you can hardly avoid Las Casas. He's not only one of the most important sources that we know of everything we know really about these difficult decades, but he's also the most important point of reference for all subsequent interpretations that paint Spain as a bedrock of backwardness, cruelty, obscurantism, priest-ridden superstition, genocidal mania, and the list could go on. It is a tradition that has proved extremely difficult to escape. And this is in part because it has never, until quite recently, been properly questioned. So we need to spend just a little bit of time working out exactly how this happened. If we start at the beginning by looking at the various English and some Dutch perceptions of Spain's activities in the New World, during the reign of Holy Roman Emperor Charles V, as you know, was a very long reign, 40 years, stretching from 1516 to 1566, the picture we get is almost unambiguously positive. The deeds of Hernán Cortés, the conqueror of Mexico, of Francisco Pizarro, the conqueror of Peru, are recounted with undisguised approbation, and even a desire to emulate them. In fact, both of them emerge as parallels to the heroes of late antiquity, frequent comparisons with Caesar, with Alexander. So it's not really the image of obscurantism that we tend to get. But then comes the period of Charles's son and heir, Philip II, another long reign, 42 years, stretching from 1556 to 1598. Now, it was at this time that Spain reached the peak of its power, something that happened to coincide with the rapid spread of cheap print. So it's hardly surprising that Philip became the first victim of the anti-Spanish propagandists. This trend reached a high point in 1581 with the publication of the Apology of William the Silent, Prince of Orange, and leader of the traumatic anti-Spanish Dutch revolt. In his apology, William painted a picture of Philip completely based on unfounded, trumped-up evidence, accusing him of crimes ranging from adultery and incest to the murder of his wife and son. Of course, those lovers of opera among you will know the story very well because it is largely reproduced in Giuseppe Verdi's Don Carlos, which is almost entirely based on Friedrich Schiller's play of the same name. And even in the 19th century, a time when historians began to pride themselves on needing to write history as it actually happened, the famous Leopold von Ranke's famous dictum, wie es eigentlich gewesen, and we still find at this time unforgettable gems. Allow me to share my favorite with you. It comes from John Lothrop Motley, the distinguished American diplomat and historian, author of no less than 7 volumes on the history of the Netherlands. Now, when he comes to Philip II, this is what he has to say. It's absolutely marvelous. Listen carefully. He says, if Philip possessed a single virtue, it has eluded the conscientious research of the writer of these pages. If there are vices, as possibly there are, from which he was exempt, this is because it is not permitted by human nature to attain perfection. even in evil. Wie es eigentlich gewesen? I wonder. Now, the obvious question that emerges in all this is why? Why were these interpretations never adequately questioned? What was it that gave them such authority and persuasive power? Well, as I've already alluded to, the work of Las Casas is right in the middle of the whole problem. Because you see, William of Orange and all who came in his wake made ample use of the many polemical tracts that Las Casas wrote with the specific purpose of shocking the Spanish ministers into implementing reform. It's hardly surprising that these tracts, the most famous of which you probably know, the Brevísima Relación, the most brief account of the destruction of the Indies, it's not surprising that they should contain vivid descriptions of Spanish atrocities, mostly written in impersonal terms. For example, just give you some examples. The indigenous peoples are depicted by Las Casas as gentle lambs pasturing in unspoilt green fields in a state of innocence, reminiscent of a prelapsarian idyll. While the Spaniards are portrayed as ferocious, merciless, ravenous wolves who leave a trail of devastation of apocalyptic proportions in their wake. Besides, Spain's detractors had the clear advantage of being able to appeal to Las Casas' own frequent insistence that he knew what he was talking about, simply because he had witnessed all these atrocities with his own eyes. They could therefore argue that these polemical tracts were accurate records of historical fact. So the tradition endured and was happily taken over by the nationalist historians in particular, that began to be written on both sides of the Atlantic in the 19th century, all of them very eager to paint an image of what became known as Imperial Spain as simply 300 years of relentless obscurantism and bigoted oppression. So, I hope you can see how the image of Las Casas as a lonely voice crying in the wilderness against the forces of darkness that surrounded him fits so neatly into this tradition. It has in fact become almost the default interpretation in the general histories. But what I want to persuade you about is that Las Casas himself would certainly not have shared this vision. In fact, I'm pretty sure he would have been mortified had he known to what use those Protestant heretics, as he often referred to them, would put his various polemics. Besides, there is an elementary problem with the chronology of such an interpretation. We only need to remember that Las Casas first arrived in Hispaniola, the Caribbean island that is now Haiti and the Dominican Republic. He first arrived there in 1502. Therefore, none of the events he recounts before these dates, and there are many, could have been witnessed by him with his own eyes, as he liked to insist. And it would be some time before he began to think seriously about questions of justice. By his own account, his conscience was first stirred by the justly famous sermon of the Dominican friar Antonio de Montesinos, which was preached in Santo Domingo in December 1511. Now, Las Casas is the only source we have for this event, and it certainly has the ring of personal experience. It's a very, very famous event, but it is well worth revisiting because it captures everything that Las Casas would try to say in subsequent writings. He recounts how Montesinos stood up to preach on an Advent Sunday in December 1511 and said, "I am a voice crying in the wilderness." These obviously were well-known words of the prophet Isaiah, but that particular Sunday they came from chapter 3 of the Gospel of St. Matthew. But that morning, Montesinos decided to deploy what Las Casas would later refer to as his cholerical tone, determined to make the congregation listen, and I quote, "not lightly and half-heartedly, but with all your hearts and all your senses." The words he was uttering quote again, that were the freshest, sharpest, heaviest, most dreadful and dangerous that they had ever heard. And then after a dramatic pause, during which, as Las Casas would later claim to recall, those present felt as if they were about to hear the voice of Christ himself at the last judgment. And Montesinos continued, "This voice says that you are living and may die in mortal sin because of the cruelty and tyranny with which you deal with this innocent people." And then he asked them by what right or under what deluded conception of justice they were doing this. To what authority could they possibly appeal to justify such detestable behavior? Are they not human? This is a famous bit that everybody quotes. Are they not human? Do they not have rational souls? Are you not bound to love them as you love yourselves? Do you not understand this? Do you not feel this? How is it that you linger so obliviously in a slumber of such deep lethargy? Well, justly famous words. And yet, despite the clear ring of authenticity, it is in fact quite unlikely that Las Casas would have witnessed this event. Simply because, you see, in 1511, he was actually taking part in the conquest of Cuba. After which he received a grant of land that included the virtually free labor of indigenous peoples, what the settlers in the Caribbean called an encomienda. In other words, the malign system of exploitation that Las Casas himself would spend so much energy fulminating against. Despite the fact that by this time he had also been ordained to the priesthood, he seemed to see no contradiction between a Christian sense of justice and the practice of using native laborers to extract gold from the mines. He also had a very good business sense because he very soon detected and took advantage of a growing culinary penchant among the Spanish settlers throughout the Caribbean. So he set up a very prosperous green turtle farm in the south of Cuba and was making quite a lot of money out of this. This behavior was, of course, not uncharacteristic of the average member of the secular clergy in contemporary Europe. They were all marked, well, most of them, marked by neither by piety nor by learning. And I think Las Casas at this time was quite content with thinking of himself growing rich along these very lines. But it was in Cuba that he was to experience a dramatic change of heart. When exactly it was that a Dominican friar refused him absolution on the basis that he held Indians in encomienda is not entirely clear, but the change was glaringly obvious by the time he was preparing a sermon in the spring of 1514. The reading for the day from the book of Ecclesiasticus was unambiguous. It read, who robs the poor and then brings sacrifice is of their fellowship that would immolate some innocent child before the eyes of his father. Poor man's bread is poor man's life. Cheat him of it, and you have slain him. A few months after this, we find Las Casas back in Spain, having given up his encomienda, having delivered a number of impassioned sermons to Cuban encomenderos, as the owners of the encomiendas were known. And then he soon secured an audience with the king, Ferdinand II of Aragon, and also won the goodwill of the primate of Spain, the eminent humanist Franciscan Cardinal Francisco Jiménez de Cisneros, founder of the University of Alcalá and engaged in the reform of the mendicant orders. Now, the news that Las Casas brought with him were not precisely news to the king and the cardinal, because they had been closely monitoring the debates that the sermon of Montesinos had provoked a few years previously. The enraged reaction of the authorities in Hispaniola, who accused Montesinos and his fellow Dominicans of spreading dangerous doctrines which would put at risk the very authority of the crown, understandably enraged the king. After all, he had only recently himself sponsored the Dominican mission to Hispaniola. So the last thing he was expecting was such an affront on his authority. Now, this response left Montesinos and his supporters with little choice but to return to Spain to explain to the king that they had never questioned his authority or the rights of the crown in the New World. What they had questioned, and they were very sure that the king himself would do the same, was the heartless exploitation of the indigenous peoples at the hands of unscrupulous Spanish settlers. These arguments led the king to convene a council of civil lawyers, canonists and theologians at the city of Burgos in northern Spain, leading to the promulgation of what we know as the Laws of Burgos in 1513. Now, this was a very important landmark in the slow and convoluted process by which the Spanish crown would gradually become aware of its obligations towards the indigenous peoples. But Las Casas was not impressed. Although the laws had addressed the abuses of the encomienda system, they had not recommended its outright abolition, which, according to Las Casas, was the only way to ensure justice. You had to get rid of this institution. What was much worse was that the very people who had drafted the proposed reforms were also responsible for producing perhaps the most maligned and deplored of all the documents of the whole saga, the famous or infamous requerimiento, meaning requirement. This was a very lengthy manifesto which was to be read by a notary to any indigenous peoples before the Spaniards could initiate hostilities against them. Las Casas famously said that he did not know whether to laugh or to cry when he read it, and we can understand why. Let me just rehearse the argument so that you can get inside Las Casas' reaction. It went like this. It said, although all humans descend from one man and one woman, 5,000 years of history had dispersed them into many nations. Of these nations, some were clearly more equal than others, especially because St. Peter had invested his successors, the popes, with the authority to judge and govern everyone, whether they were Christian or not. Now, one of these popes had donated the newly discovered lands to the Castilian monarchs and their successors. And here I quote, as is made clear in copious writings pertaining to the subject, which you can see if you so wish. Then the document states that it is clearly in the interests of anyone to heed the authority of the Pope, which implied serving the Castilian monarchs, and I quote again, with goodwill, without resistance, immediately, and without delay. If they did this, then they would be treated with all love and charity. But if they didn't, then we shall make war against you and subject you to the yoke and obedience of the church and their highnesses, and any loss, harm, or death will be your fault, and not that of their highnesses, nor ours, nor of these gentlemen in our company. Well, I can see that you're on the verge of laughter rather than tears, and that means that you agree with most of Las Casas' contemporaries, actually, because at the very first reading of the requerimiento in what is now Colombia, it happened in June 1513, the chronicler who tells the story, who was present, recounts that he made the following observation. He said, it would seem that these natives will not listen to the theology of the requerimiento. And unfortunately, we have no one here who can help them understand it. So he suggested that the leader of the expedition should put the document away until, and I quote, we have put one of these natives in a cage so that he might have the leisure needed to learn it, and then my Lord Bishop might want to explain it to him. He then handed the document to the leader, who burst into hysterical laughter. And then the same chronicler recounts how the very lawyer who had drafted the document also burst into laughter when he recounted the incident to him. So you see, there was something more going on than we get from Las Casas' account about how he felt so enraged. Now, of course, Las Casas did not witness any of these farces. He only had access to the text, which understandably enraged him. After subjecting the text to his customary critical scrutiny, he called it, and this is characteristically Lascassian in the flurry of adjectives. He loved his adjectives, and he just wrote that this document is unjust, impious, scandalous, irrational, and absurd. So pretty categoric. And it's no surprise, of course, that Las Casas' impassioned condemnation has gone largely unchallenged, even in modern scholarship. But this is, I think, unfortunate because it has fostered a misleading blind spot in our perception. Because you see, at the heart of Las Casas' critique is the radically mistaken assumption that the Requerimiento was based on the condemned doctrines of Henry of Susa, the 13th century Italian canonist, better known as Ostienses, who had endorsed the theories of one of the most extreme defenders of papal power in the 13th century, the English canon lawyer Alanus Anglicus. Now, according to this view, Christ's incarnation had brought about a transfer of all legitimate possession, what in the jargon of the time was called dominium, and which for the sake of consistency I will continue to use, dominium. So he had given all legitimate dominion first to Christ, and then, through Christ, to St. Peter and his successors. So far you can see where Las Casas is coming from. The view is practically identical to the first section of the Requerimiento. However, from this basis, Ostienses maintained, following Alanus, that infidel rulers could not possess dominion, and that Christians were perfectly within their rights to conquer any infidel society in good conscience. Now, the issue had been widely debated, especially at the Council of Constance in the early 15th century, and the context, of course, was a crisis that emerged by the teaching of another famous Englishman, John Wycliffe, the leader of the Lollards, which had found an echo in Bohemia in the person of Jan Hus. You will remember that both Wycliffe and Hus had stated that prelates, clerics, and even bishops lost any legitimate dominion if they were in a state of mortal sin. Some cynics say, well, of course, the church had to condemn the issue because if they hadn't, the church would have disappeared at this time. But I think the opinion was categorically condemned at the council because they just wanted to reiterate the ruling of Pope Innocent IV. Innocent IV had already made this ruling back in the 13th century in the context of the first contacts with the Mongols of Central Asia in the middle of the 13th century. The same question had emerged. Do Christians have legitimate rights over these people? And Innocent IV had said absolutely not. All rational creatures, whether Christian or infidel, possessed dominion as the effect of nature rather than grace. Okay, so you can see that any association with Ostienses would have been steeped in heresy, and no canon lawyer worthy of his salt would have felt even remotely tempted to use this theory in defense of anything. So the idea that the framers of the Requerimiento actually did this is bizarre in the extreme. The central point of the document was precisely that the indigenous peoples of the New World possessed dominion, despite their not being in a state of grace. Otherwise, what would have been the point of presenting them with a free choice? So once you begin to understand this, it doesn't seem so surprising that Las Casas' impassioned opposition to the document raised some quite understandable suspicions in the Spanish court. Of course, he had already won the goodwill of the king and the cardinal, but the king died in January 1516, and the cardinal had to suffer the bombardment of the enemies of Las Casas, who had returned from Cuba and Hispaniola to file formal complaints against him, accusing him of all sorts of things. This is just my favorite quote found in the archive of the Indies in Seville. They accused Las Casas of being lightweight, with little authority, and unworthy of trust, because he speaks about things which he does not know and has not seen, despite his claims, and giving reasons that in themselves contradict one another. So, although Cisneros had already made up his mind that the complaints of Las Casas needed to be addressed urgently, he was very cautious in the way he went about it. And without consulting Las Casas, he appointed a group of Hieronymite friars entrusted with the task of implementing reform. Now, this initiative made Las Casas quite anxious. You see, he had got wind that some of the Hieronymites had been won over by his opponents, making them ill-disposed towards the indigenous people. He therefore demanded to travel in the same ship, arguing that he could then inform the Hieronymites about exactly what was going on back in Hispaniola. But the friars refused to allow Las Casas to travel with them, and the reason they gave is that the presence of this cleric would do little to help our peace of mind. Obviously, Las Casas had developed a reputation for stirring things up, which they weren't welcoming at the time. Las Casas, of course, was completely undeterred, and he traveled in a ship only a few days after the Hieronymites had left. Once in Hispaniola, he incited the opposition of the bulk of the settlers by insisting that the Hieronymites were not showing enough compassion for the indigenous people or any willingness to address their spiritual or material needs. So again, he succeeded in irritating the bulk of the settlers, and this soon convinced Las Casas that his influence would be much more effective back in Spain. And there we find him barely 6 months later. He's back in Spain in June 1517. Now, it was not, alas, the Spain that he had left a mere 6 months earlier, because he found Cardinal Cisneros. His plan was to go straight to him and explain what had happened. He was on his deathbed, so he couldn't receive Las Casas. The new king, who was Charles of Ghent, the Habsburg, had yet to arrive in Spain. He was making his way from the Netherlands at the time. And therefore the Castilian court was a hotbed of scheming intrigue. But Las Casas really seemed in his element here. As soon as the new king arrived, he adapted quickly to the change of circumstances. He wasted no time in ingratiating himself with Charles's old tutor, Adrian of Utrecht, another famous religious reformer who would become Pope Adrian VI. But at this time he had been appointed cardinal and grand inquisitor. And Las Casas very soon won his unconditional support and even the authorization to reserve the continental landmass known as Cumaná, which is along the Caribbean coast of what is now Colombia and Venezuela, to reserve this whole region exclusively for the mendicant orders. After this, Las Casas went about the business of persuading people in various regions of Old Castile to leave their poverty behind, as he said. Follow me, migrate with me to the New World, and become rich. By October 1518, he had recruited a staggering 3,000 volunteers. Then he claimed that the number could have been trebled, actually, had he not been very cautious, because he thought that if he had attracted any more, he would probably irritate the aristocrats who would not be amused by the loss of so much cheap labor. Then there is a further twist to the story, and it is the new king's election as Holy Roman Emperor in June 1519, after which, of course, he became known as Charles V. Now, Las Casas eagerly welcomed the news, for he had already persuaded Charles's new chancellor, Mercurino Arborio, the famous Marquis of Gattinara, that his project for Cumaná could be seen as a first step towards implementing Gattinara's own rather quaint vision of Charles as a pastoral world emperor. And so, with Gattinara's support, a committee was set up to assist Las Casas, in which the Cumaná project was refined with a new imperial vision clearly in mind. The proposed settlers were to be given knightly titles, hitherto reserved for the official elite of the Holy Roman Empire. They would be known as the Knights of the Golden Spur. They were to be accompanied by 12 mendicants and 10 native interpreters. And of course, they were to be allowed to trade in pearls and to have a good quantity of African slaves at their service. Now, the expedition reached Puerto Rico in early January 1521. And there, Las Casas very soon realized that his followers were much less amenable to his designs than he had imagined. Some fell ill and died, some settled so well in Puerto Rico that they refused to leave, and many were attracted by the new opportunities offered by settlers in the other islands, Hispaniola, Cuba, and Jamaica, among others. So when Las Casas set off for Cumaná in July 1521, he had only a handful of his original companions with him. And then after reaching Cumaná in August, he barely had time to supervise the construction of a settlement before being surprised by a fierce attack launched by the local inhabitants. 2 months later, we find him back in Santo Domingo in a state of deep disillusionment, and there he sought the help of his Dominican friends. The inevitable mockery that the disastrous experiment provoked among the settlers only served to convince him that the failure was a divine punishment for the element of greed that he had allowed to dominate his plans. And from then on, he convinced himself that any future venture could afford no flirtation with money. There follows a prolonged period of examination, after which, in 1524, he made up his mind to enter the order of preachers, the Dominicans. He became your brother. Now, little is known about his activities in the following years, but it is certain that he kept a very close eye on developments in the New World, because things had changed quite dramatically. You see, in 1521, Hernán Cortés had taken Tenochtitlan, Mexico, the capital of Mexico. And in the process, he had established beyond reasonable doubt that the New World was not the imagined Indies, as they were still called, but something previously unknown and quite unprecedented. Something, in other words, which raised fundamental questions about the arguments so far deployed for justifying the Spanish presence in the new territories. The papal bulls of donation were still at the center of the debate, of course. They had never been universally accepted, but at least they could claim that the Christians were merely engaged in the recovery of lands that had previously belonged to them. So indeed, the first decades of exploration were justified on the basis that, as Columbus called it, the enterprise of the Indies would be the first stage in a process that would culminate in the conquest of Jerusalem. That was the aim. And this was to be done with the help of Asian Christians, which a lot of people in Spain still thought that's what the Spaniards had come across in the Caribbean. Asian Christians eager to join forces with the Spaniards against their Islamic oppressors. Now, after the conquest of Mexico, the whole legal basis of the enterprise needed to be rethought. And this is the context for an otherwise intriguing memorial that Las Casas presented to the Council of the Indies in 1531, but which is obvious that he had been preparing for several years beforehand. It was written in full knowledge that Cortés, the conqueror of Mexico, had managed to persuade Charles V that his actions in Mexico could be justified simply because the Aztec emperor, Moctezuma, had willingly submitted to the authority of the Holy Roman Emperor, and had even explained to Cortés that he had been expecting this moment eagerly, because it had been predicted by his ancestors. So they were just waiting for Christians to arrive and remind them of their true origins. So all these ancestors were implicitly painted by Cortés in an unambiguously Christian light. Well, of course, Las Casas was understandably enraged by what he could only interpret as Cortés's shameful duplicity. In his memorial, he warned the ministers of the council in typically prophetic language that they risked eternal damnation for having allowed the destruction of the Indies to continue unchecked. And he continues with exactly the same imagery that I painted before of the gentle lambs and the fierce lions and all that sort of thing. But the interesting point to notice is that the reasons that Las Casas gave for his condemnation do not really break any new ground at this stage. They actually fall back on a very traditional understanding, and one that is ironically dangerously close to the era of Hostienses that he had misleadingly detected in their requerimiento. What he argued was this, that divine providence, acting through the vicar of Christ, the Pope, had enthroned the Emperor Charles V as another Joseph to rule over a new Israel, and had entrusted him with the mission of bringing the Christian faith to the indigenous peoples. So this was the only justifying principle that he could allude to. Instead, he said, only robbers and tyrants had gone to the Indies, plundering, killing, and oppressing the natives with intolerable burdens. And then, once the wars of conquest had been accomplished, there ensued the second unmerciful sorrow, as he called it, of tyrannical government. And he finished by asking, what are great kingdoms without justice but great latrochinia? You know, he explains, obviously, a straight quote from St. Augustine. Latrochinia are, of course, bands of robbers. So what was the solution? Well, abolish the encomienda for goodness sake. That's what he said. Punish the tyrants, appoint prudent and just royal officials. And they got to be supported by a bishop and by mendicant friars. Those were his proposals. Now, in many respects, Las Casas was clearly here preaching to the converted, because Cortés himself had already given his enthusiastic support to the mendicant friars, who were at the time engaged in a remarkably successful evangelizing project throughout central Mexico, a very impressive accomplishment that Las Casas himself would praise in due course. Also, the first bishop of Mexico had been appointed in 1528. And although Cortés himself had been honored by Charles V, he had also been ably sidelined on his return to Mexico, where he was faced by a raft of royal officials determined to frustrate the expansion of any seigneurial ambitions and preparing the ground for the establishment of a vice-regal system of government. So, as you can see, of all the proposals listed in Las Casas' memorial, only the abolition of the encomienda was left in the lurch. But it was clear to everyone at the time that the opposition that any such implementation would provoke would run against the most basic considerations of political prudence. Besides, at least in theory, there was little in the institution of the encomienda that would necessarily frustrate the successful evangelization of indigenous peoples. In fact, the bulk of mendicant opinion in Mexico had forcefully argued along those very lines. So Las Casas' position was not too sure at this time, but we mustn't conclude from this that his memorial was merely filed and dismissed. Its impassioned, prophetic tone was very difficult to ignore, and I would even go so far as to suggest that it actually prepared the ground for the reactions of rightful indignation that spread very rapidly among the members of the council and even the emperor himself when the news from Peru began to arrive in 1533. In particular, the betrayal unfair trial and execution of Atahualpa, the Inca emperor, really embarrassed Charles V, and it enraged him at the same time. He said that the most shameful aspect of the whole saga had been that the decision had been taken in the name of justice. He asked, what kind of justice were these unworthy Spaniards talking about? It was now clear in his mind that the whole issue needed to be debated anew and clarified once and for all. And only a few months later, we find the most brilliant theologian at Salamanca, probably one of the most brilliant minds of the age, the Dominican Francisco de Vitoria, writing to a friend, and I quote here, "After a lifetime of studies and long experience, no business shocks me or embarrasses me more than the corrupt profits and affairs of the Indies. Their very mention freezes the blood in my veins." Well, of course, by this time, Vitoria had been commissioned by Charles V to study the issue, and this culminated in an astonishing set of lectures delivered at Salamanca in 1539. Vitoria began with the startling claim that all the arguments hitherto used to justify the Spanish presence in America were no longer valid. He did this very subtly by posing the question of what right the Spanish had to, what right could the Spaniards allude to in order to subject the indigenous peoples. Okay? Now, the word he used for what I've just called right was use, I-U-S. Okay? A term which in the 16th century was inseparable from the ancient principle commonly known as suum cuique, which St. Thomas Aquinas, was Vitoria's most important source of inspiration, had defined as, and I quote, the lasting and constant will of rendering to each his or her due. Now, the Latin term that St. Thomas used for what I've just called due was also use, I-U-S. So what exactly was this? Vitoria, again following Aquinas, argued that the answer could not begin with the question of justice. Why was this? Well, because given that the act of justice was to give to each his or her due, then, as Aquinas had put it, the act of justice is preceded by the act whereby something becomes someone's due. Or in other words, and these are also Aquinas' words, the act by virtue of which something comes to be due to a person cannot itself be an act of justice. So the question remained, where exactly did this due, this use, come from? And again, following Aquinas, Vitoria argued that it had to come from the very being of the one to whom the due was owed, the very being. Now here, of course, in English we have a problem because the term being is not, it's a bit nebulous, isn't it? It's not very helpful. But if we remind ourselves that the word used by Vitoria and Aquinas was actually esse or ens, we can try to get inside their minds and the conviction that beyond accepting that there were things due to someone because of that someone's being, in the full Latin sense of the word, meaning that which is at the beginning and at the end of any process of knowing, beyond that, language necessarily had to fail, as it always did whenever an attempt was made to render a self-evident concept more intelligible. Now, you might be wondering what all this has to do with Las Casas, and I will tell you that it has quite a bit to do with him, because you see, from this basis, Vitoria would address the thorny question of dominium in a way that actually took Las Casas somewhat by surprise. In fact, it would take him quite a few years to come to terms with the way in which Vitoria categorically rejected that the so-called donation of the Pope had granted the Castilian monarchs any legitimacy in the New World. He had already set out this argument 6 years previously in his lectures on the power of the church, where he had pithily argued that the popes had no power whatsoever that they could donate to anyone, for the simple reason that, quote, nobody can give what he hasn't got. So at a stroke, Victoria had deprived the crown of the one prop for its presence in America that still had a degree of respectability, even among passionate defenders of the indigenous peoples like Las Casas himself. And from there, Victoria went on to consider the whole range of arguments being deployed at the time to invest the Castilian crown with dominion in America. And he concluded that none of them could be upheld. No just title could be drawn from either the divine or the natural law, nor by extension could it be drawn from any human or positive law. Now, Victoria did not conclude from this that the crown, as you might think, the logical step would be for the crown just to withdraw, but he did not conclude this. He said that it would not be justified in merely washing its hands, punishing transgressors, and abandoning the enterprise. And this was because, given that many Spaniards were already settled in America, and that large numbers of indigenous peoples had converted to the Christian faith, he said, it would be neither expedient nor lawful for our prince to abandon altogether the administration of those territories. Now, in support of this position, Victoria drew on a further category of law, which hovered somewhat ambiguously between the natural and the human or positive law. And this was known as the law of nations, the jus gentium, which had originally been used by Romans in their dealings with non-Romans. Now, the tradition that Victoria inherited had gone through several transformations, and the jus gentium had been associated with the universality attributed to the natural law, but not with its immutability. Okay, so you have this new conception of law that could be associated with the natural law in terms of universality, but that everybody was aware that it could not be immutable simply because it was subject to history and contingency. Nevertheless, its participation in the natural law allowed Victoria to interpret the jus gentium as a body of laws enacted by the whole world, which he called a commonwealth. He said the whole world is, in a sense, a commonwealth. And from this it followed that just as a commonwealth should take precedence over a nation, so the jus gentium should take precedence over individual societies. So even those societies that had never been formed part of the Roman Empire, because this is one of the arguments, how could you apply this to societies that were never part of the Roman Empire? And Victoria said, well, even those societies could be subject to the jus gentium, because just as they were subject to the natural law and the divine laws, the jus gentium obviously had an impact on these societies as well. And it was on this basis that Spaniards could claim the right, the use, I-U-S, of natural partnership, sorry about that, Freudian slip, natural partnership and communication, which in turn gave them the right to travel, the right to trade, and the right to preach. And then as an afterthought, Victoria also conceded that it allowed the waging of just wars if they were involved in the defense of innocent people against tyrants. So, as you can see, Victoria had left enough loopholes to appease the king's conscience. But the fact that the great theologian had come so close to arguing the emperor out of the larger portion of his empire had not gone unnoticed. Victoria's views soon became something of an orthodoxy, an inescapable point of reference for every subsequent effort to ensure that the indigenous peoples were not unduly exploited. This is the atmosphere that greeted Las Casas on his return to Spain in 1540 after years of incessant travels across the American continent, during which he had written perhaps what is the most attractive and accessible of his works, entitled De unico vocationis modo omnium gentium ad veram religionem, on the only way of attracting all peoples to the true religion. What particularly shines through in this treatise is the dedicated study and reflection that had marked the years after Las Casas joined the Dominican order. The treatise is firmly rooted in patristic thought, particularly the writings of St. Augustine and St. John Chrysostom, whom he cites over and over again. But its central premise is founded on the Aristotelian conviction that Aquinas had unambiguously endorsed, that all human beings, all human minds in particular, are the same in essence, and that all human beings are innately susceptible to moral training. So back in Spain, aware of the pangs of conscience that Victoria's conclusions had provoked, Las Casas once again deployed his unrivaled skills in the production of polemical diatribes, consciously aimed at horrifying the emperor and his ministers into implementing reform, and the tactic soon paid off in a set of legislative measures known as the New Laws, which were promulgated in 1542. They were a determined attempt to assert direct royal authority in America. Among other things, they deprived all abusive encomenderos of their indigenous laborers. They denied the granting of encomiendas to any royal officials or members of the clergy, and forbade any further grants of encomiendas by the stipulation that on the death of the current incumbents, all their indigenous subjects would automatically revert to the crown. A greater triumph for Las Casas could barely be imagined. His own enthusiasm can be seen in the eagerness with which, in 1544, he accepted his appointment as Bishop of Chiapas, the predominantly Dominican region of southern Mexico. Now, as you probably all know, the experiment did not last very long. The inflexible and compromising position he adopted, combined with his inability to navigate the intricacies of a delicate political situation, soon made his position quite untenable. So he returned to Spain after barely a year, and from then on he decided to dedicate himself to what he knew he was good at: campaigning at court and compiling his monumental works of history, as well as a work of astonishing originality, the Apologetica Historia Summaria. I'd like to conclude with a suggestion that this work can only be understood by revisiting a famous and curiously misunderstood debate. I mean the one that took place in Valladolid in 1550 and 1551, where Las Casas confronted the distinguished humanist Juan Ginés de Sepúlveda. Many of you will be aware of this. The default interpretation of this debate is that Las Casas merely refuted Sepúlveda's very questionable view that the Spanish crown was perfectly justified in subjugating the indigenous peoples simply because they fitted the Aristotelian category of natural slaves. Well, Sepúlveda's argument is in fact much more subtle and much more interesting than that. And I want to suggest to you that it actually made Las Casas think very seriously about the issue, leading to many revisions, reinterpretations, and one very radical change of direction. At the beginning of the debate, for example, Las Casas seemed in no doubt that the Pope had the authority to expropriate and reassign indigenous property. In other words, he was still wedded to the idea that dominion was the result of grace rather than nature. In the revisions he made after the debate, he argued that indigenous peoples were under no obligation to recognize the Pope's authority, to curtail or transfer their sovereignty to the advantage of the Spanish crown. You will agree that this is a very significant revision. My claim is that it remained at the center of the monumental treatises that he refined and revised during the final years of his life. He eventually died 15 years after the debate in 1566. And in these treatises, it's here that we find the true originality of his contribution. not in the polemical diatribes for which